Hello, Rainer.
Hey Tina, nice to meet you.
Nice to see you too. Rainer, in the exhibition, we present several speculative creatures from your series Beings. They have beautiful names like Pulcheria sensitiva, Dearest Sensitive One, or Dione Valida, Firm, Healthy Mother of Venus. In total, there are more than 300 different beings. You have created a cosmos, a whole new world. What is the idea behind Beings and why did you start developing the series?
Yes, we're living in a world where more and more organisms are not running by evolution and natural development, but by the human interest. I just thought if this is happening, we as artists should somehow interact with this reality we are facing. So what are we doing with these organisms instead of using them like everybody else? So we start creating new ones which are not in the concept of all the economical and agricultural and pharmaceutical world, but they are just really made by the ideas of artists. I'm the first one who starts this, but we should be much more. So everybody is invited to take over. And there are some artists that were following this idea and doing their own beings. But I was trying to find out, is there any necessity for sculpture anymore? You can say, okay, we have a gallery, we have a private space, we have a museum where art objects like sculptures are more like a poetry in space, or they are just to delight the people. But I wasn't happy with this, and I thought, okay, so how can we continue creating art in a way that has a different necessity and is pushing the society outside of the cultural sphere more? And so I came up with this project. I was always, since I was a small child, interested in nature, mostly the vegetative area, like the plants and shrubs, trees, all this kind of things, but also other organisms. I was digging into this deeply and felt very connected to this, not like a natural scientist, but somehow different. So I was like, will I become a researcher or will I become an artist? I didn't know. But in the end, I thought there's much more freedom and maybe it's much more needed to be an artist. And then also, I was very good at maths and sciences in the beginning, but then I kind of dropped and got a bit more lousy. So I thought, okay, this is not for me. I go the second direction and become an artist. And here I am.
Yes, I think it was a really good decision and it gives you also the freedom to be more open, to be speculative, to not be tied to scientific facts. And I think that is exactly what you're doing with the series Beings, creating your own notion of these different creatures and their own systems. You approach the topic also from a post-human perspective. You say that these creatures could or would live here on our planet after the humans died out. Is this correct?
Well, I don't care so much about the humans. Maybe they're around still, maybe they're not around, maybe they're slaves of these organisms, and maybe something else happens. And there's one project which is connected to this project, but quite individual. It's called Sexual Creeping.
Mhm.
There are stories, just texts. Whereas in the body of work, you were just talking about the being entity. It's sculptures that are only working with little text. They sound like natural scientific descriptions of organisms, and it has to be because they're really very precise sketches of entities that are to become. Now, this other project, Sexual Creeping, started with texts, and there's stories of organisms to be that are so strong that they take over the power of humans. So they seduce them sexually, and they think it's going to be fantastic. But then in the end, these organisms are just using this as an entrance to overcome the power of the humans, and they take over. They grow into something, mingling themselves with parts of the human bodies. They just destroy and destruct from inside, ending in a catastrophe for the human, not for this other organism. The other organism is quite happy with it because
I
this
can
is what it
imagine.
wants.
Yes.
And so I also made sculptures that are kind of explicitly showing the way these organisms are working, but the audience has them on their lap. You hear this on headphones, you get the sculpture by some service person, and you get it into your hands, on your lap, or over your shoulder, and you deal with it while you're listening. So you make the connection yourself, and it's quite intense.
This is when you have installed the beings like in a physical space.
This is how I present it in a safe space. You go to some lounge chair, or you go to some sofa, and then you may be there alone or with somebody else. To come to the show now, I really was surprised because this wasn't my idea. But I thought, how did you know this? Some of the creatures in this landscape, if I go with my avatar and I hit them, they move. And this is what I really like, because I don't like sculptures to be just looked at with your eyes. I like to touch them with my hands. I created these sculptures from some rubbery material so that you can really interact with them and use them. And so I was surprised that you came up with this idea, which is really related to my way of treating sculptures. Just bump them around, and I really like this.
Well, I'm really happy that you're saying this, because I already felt that it would be interesting also that you use the virtual conditions and that you say, well, these objects are not just 3D models. You can interact with them. You can really push them. You can bounce them basically, and to animate them a little in this realm. What I like so much about the beings, every being, every one of the 300 lives in certain places. Some lives overground, some lives underground, and I wasn't able in the exhibition, with the exhibition architecture I provide, to deliver these different kinds of places where they would usually live. So I'm happy that they are not just sculptures, as you say, which you look at, but that they are somehow animated and can also move around. Yeah, maybe Reiner, you can tell us a little more about the beings, and you can choose one of them and explain a little more about its natural habitat, which it usually would live in, that you created.
Of course, there is, for example, Pulcheria sensitiva. Like all these sculptures, they are like sketches for organisms. Like a researcher in the rainforest, you find some new species and you have to name it. This is your obligation. As I'm designing them, I need to call them and give them a name. So it's the family name and the art name. And this is Pulcheria sensitiva. It's the dearest sensitive one. And this one asking the question, are we one or are we many? In the 1910s, 20s, there were some writers, philosophers in Germany, they're questioning many things. And there was Ernst Fuhrmann, who had the idea, if I look at a tree, is the tree one organism or are there like many? And he said, okay, we have all these leaves and we have all these little tubes. So the leaves live for 1 year. So he said there are thousands or 10,000s of singular organisms, and they all unite to be stronger, and they seem to be one, but actually they are not one. They are all individuals. And of course, there are organisms in biology that are individual cells and are living as individual cells. And then if there's some necessity, they gather and they become one. And the unity of individuals dissolves in new permanent states of Pulcheria sensitiva. Single individuals of Pulcheria sensitiva have combined psychologically to clusters of organisms of collective living substance. The upright shape is stabilized by lime and acid fibers from elastic frame protein containing iodine. This organism lives very secretively and leaves its hiding place only at the time of fertilization. If one organism is moved, the others move along. In the process, little ripe descendants break away and swarm out individually. At another location, they might form a new cluster of organisms.
Beautiful. Thank you for giving us insights into like the detailed worlds of one of your beings. We already talked about this a little, that beings are a hybrid project existing in the physical space and also existing in the virtual space. So from your point of view, what are the advantages of presenting the beings in each of the world? What are the advantages of the physical world? What are the advantages of the virtual world to present series?
Yeah. The classical intention of sculptures is, I would say, to create them, make them as desirable as possible and sell them. But in this case, I am not about selling them. It's more like they are a core to reflect on the possibilities we have going forward with living nature. Like, where do we want to go and what goals could we achieve? And therefore, I was making these sculptures and trying to communicate this in a very wide way. So I made a book that you can go to the shop and buy this. And I put them on the internet so that you can see the photograph, the text of the sculptures. But then when the 3D scanning came up, I thought, no, this is the way. Now there's the Museum of Contemporary Art in Taipei. They show 60 or 70 of these sculptures, but all of the rest of the world cannot see them. So now with this 3D printing, after 3D scanning, in many places of the world, people can go and print them for themselves, or they can be shown and they can be as 3D models in the digital space. And this is the benefit. And I think it changes. The physical presence in the space is something else than the digital. And I'm really a physical person, so I think this is quite important. But it makes up with this multiplication and this availability worldwide. I think it's really a good way to do it. It's a bit like in the old times, you had a painting and you needed somebody to make a sketch and put this into printmaking, and then you have hundreds of copies of this painting, and so you can bring the idea across without a sense of color, without size, but you have this thing, and it's similar with this 3D sculpting, designing for me for now. I also used 3D modeling. I do this 100% digitally. And this also works, but for me now, I prefer this old-fashioned way because I think they should be not staying digitally. They should come into the real world. So for me, it's quite important that I model them in the real world because they're made for the real world. If there would be a project that is done digitally and should stay in this world, fine. But for my special project, it's quite important. And so I use 3D scanning technology.
Great, thank you. And how will you proceed with the series? Will you continue creating new beings, or will you focus on exhibiting the series virtually and physically?
It's a bit funny because this is running since 1999 or something. So I create projects that I make sculptures for a month and that's it. And this project is really running for a long time and developing because it's quite slow. This modeling is really a slow work, but still every now and again, I add another one. So it's not over, it's still running. I don't know when it's going to end, maybe when the first creature is living and kicking our legs or licking our legs or whatever it does with our legs.
Well, I think this is then just the beginning of it, a new beginning.
I think we need to make a step and go into creating this real and not just as a design. So if you do a design, you want this is a prototype which doesn't work. But if you put the engine inside and you start it, then it works. And I'm not joking, I really think we should create new organisms, artists and scientists. And of course, there needs to be some big impact of some national or private institution. But this is not just speculation. I really think this will have to be done. So we need to create organisms, not just the models I create. So this may be in another generation, but I think it's going to happen.
That's a really interesting point of view. Let's see what will be happening in the future. And thank you so much, Reiner, for being here.